So, to some extent, we're not here to talk about real estate, but everything we talk about in the next few minutes affects the real estate industry. And so, I want to start off, before we can really talk about where we are today, I want to go back in time to 1992 and take a look at what the state of Texas looked like. The audience is taking a look at a picture of this, a slide of the unemployment rates in Texas back in 1992. Leading the way was Brownsville at 16.8%. Laredo was at 10.7%. Dallas and Houston were a little above 8.5%. And so you can imagine today, where we are today, if full employment is at 5%, we're all in the 2 and 3% unemployment rate. So, Dennis, take us back to 1992. What was Laredo like? What was the border like before NAFTA?
Yeah, it was, as you described, it was a pretty much a struggling economic part of Texas. We just basically had very little business activity, and it was the beginning parts of the open trade relationships when Mexico entered into the World Trade Organization and became a part of the developed world, so to speak. We started to see business grow, but by and large, it was a transient area of the state. A lot of agricultural workers that would move up to the mid part of the country during the year and come back with their money, and very slow economy, very low levels of unemployment was very high, but even more so the ability to grow in the employment environment was not there. People couldn't really migrate up the ladder of success because there was no place to go. So it was really quite a different picture from what we see today in the dynamic economies of all the border region now that we look forward to and hope that will continue.
And I would assume with such high unemployment that there were a lot of people on public assistance programs at the time?
Oh yeah, I mean that was basically the transfer payments was probably the biggest economic factor on the border. Of some kind, some sort of a payment that was coming in for welfare support or food stamps or other support programs. So that was the border economy, basically.
So, Gerry, let's move on to the actual negotiation of NAFTA and the signing, which took place here in San Antonio in 1992. And the audience is taking a look at a photograph of the actual signing, with the three presidents as well as with the three trade negotiators. One thing that stands out in that photograph is that everybody's smiling. So tell me about the mood at the time versus where we are today.
Happy, happy, happy. Everybody was happy. You can see by the picture, it was a celebration. It was a great celebration for what had been pretty much 2 years of hard work and trying to come up with an agreement when you had three presidents, Salinas, Bush, and if you look at right there, Mulroney, that were great friends and had a great relationship. And you had three trade negotiators that had a very amiable, very, very nice relationship in the negotiation process. But it's important also to note, and being in San Antonio was a place where we actually was signed, is actually finally the law, the actual bill of the trade agreement was not signed until 14 months later. So you have, that's the next picture that you may be seeing there. And still you had, now a new president, President Clinton, and you had other presidents there. We were at both ceremonies, with San Antonio ceremony and this one here. And it's impressive to know that everybody is happy. The sad part about it is that the transition back then, when everybody was working real hard to what was a new agreement, we didn't know we all felt that it was going to be a positive. The proof was going to be, have to be shown that it was successful. That's where we are right now, when we have the third process of negotiation with the presidents.
And then the third photograph, just real quickly.
That's this one right here, and and you have President Trump in the middle, and we have President Peña Nieto, and you have Prime Minister Trudeau looking at the president saying, "What do you think they're saying?" Now what? Now what are we going to do? Now what are we going to do? So that's a little bit different. I think the relationship today obviously was very different from back in 1992.
Yeah, I think too the important thing, and I'd like to recognize Nelson Wolf here, when we were working very hard to get the trade agreement, we had a really great team with him as mayor of the city, and a very dynamic and aggressive international component of the city that worked very actively. And I think that's why we ended up with a signing here in San Antonio, because of that effort. But everybody was involved. I mean, everybody that you called on was interested in helping and supporting. And I think Gerry can report to you the sad commentary that exists with USMCA is that virtually nobody's involved. And we're seeing very, very high levels of complacency that's resulted in the process being drug out, and the fact that all of the key elements of the agreement didn't have enough input from the business sector because we had nobody participating. I think Gerry was the only person from Texas involved. And I mean, we're the #1 trading partner of Mexico, and we have one representative that goes up there to be involved in that. It's a very scary situation that now exists, and that's why we're really concerned with the current state of affairs and where we are with Congress. Are we going to get USMCA passed? Is that actually going to happen? Because that step is absolutely essential to the continuation of the agreement. And so today, with billions and billions of dollars of trade at stake, the careless indifference to this process has really got us very concerned and really alarmed, to be frank with you, that this whole issue now with the tariffs comes along, which even draws another negative attention to this process.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point that you need to remind everyone. Nelson will remember back then, back in '92, there was over 700 of us in a coalition to get NAFTA passed. And Nelson and the San Antonio Chamber, the group that was here engaged, were going up to Washington lobbying very hard. And we were bumping into each other, walking into members of Congress's office, telling our story. This time, I remember going to the first meeting of the negotiating rounds. I walked into the chamber offices, and I walked into a room, and there were 6 people in the room. And I apologized. I said, I'm in the wrong room. And said, are you here for the coalition meeting? I said, that's right. Well, this is it. 6. Coming out of NAFTA back in '90, when we had over 700 of us, and that's why I said to myself, I think we're in trouble.
And to a large extent, it seemed like what we learned along the way was a lot of people took NAFTA for granted.
Absolutely.
You've often said that not as many, or one of the mistakes that might have been made by the pro-NAFTA faction was we didn't keep educating people on the benefits of NAFTA.
Right, that's correct. That's right. And the day of the vote, we all came back home, we got to work. There was no established entity, which today that's different, because that's what the U.S. Mexico CEO dialogue or the U.S. Mexico Economic Council is aimed at being the entity that will allow for the continuity of these trade relationships to have ongoing dialogue and discussions.
Yeah, and a lot of people have forgotten that the original concept of NAFTA was not just an agreement between Canada and the United States and Mexico, but it was designed to be the first step in a hemispheric agreement for trade, because we all recognized at the time that our biggest threat was Asia, the Far East, China and South Korea and all the Asian countries, Vietnam and all those areas. And then we also recognized the European threat for competition, and then the emerging economies of Africa. So that the idea was to sign the NAFTA agreement and then extend that into Central America and into South America, where you'd have a hemispheric trade bloc that could effectively compete. And I think what we miss a lot about these trade agreements, and especially for this hemisphere, it's all about competition and survival. We cannot, as a developed nation, compete with the economies of these undeveloped countries that have a very low wage base and a large level of young populations that have the ability to produce products much cheaper than we do. And that's why all of us have benefited at the Walmart store with low prices, is because we've been able to access that low-cost provider. And so if we lose these trade agreements, or if we end up with this tariff problem, there'll be a huge increase in prices. And there's just a lot of things that we can't do anymore. The perfect ideal model for economics is everybody doing what they do best. And so we do other things than labor work today. That's not our strong suit. Our work is primarily service-oriented. We're the largest service exporter in the world. And that's where we're going to really do well, intellectual. That process that evolves around innovation and intellectual technology processes where our strengths are. And so we need to really work to our strengths. And I think that's where there's some sort of a disconnect, especially in Washington and around the country, as to really what are we trying to achieve with these trade agreements. And so this is a scary time for us on the border. Laredo just became, here a few weeks ago, the largest port in America. Do people really in Texas understand that? We passed Los Angeles. That's the size of this thing, huh?
So you have a city of 300,000 that surpassed a city the size of Los Angeles, LA Long Beach, the port of LA Long Beach.
New York?
New York, Houston, Miami, and it's Laredo, Texas. Predominantly for the 18-wheelers, the cargo, land cargo that moves.
Yeah, there's $1 billion a day of trade that passes through the port of Laredo, 14,000 18-wheelers. There's 250,000 people who cross the border every day in Texas. And we talk about closing borders, and we talk about restricting access. It's just unbelievable to us on the border to even think about things like that. That would be almost like shutting down all the major airports, or closing down all the waterways, or shutting down bridges across major areas of the country. I mean, it's just a crazy thing to think about, and these little casual, uninformed decisions that are being made mostly at the federal level are very, very scary to us because they lack reality. And the problem we've had, because trade has grown so much, that the federal government has not supported the infrastructure that we have to handle this trade. The CBP is way behind the curve already on staffing and technology and innovation at the ports. And to think about the problems that we now have with the slowdown caused by the asylum seekers, by moving people off the border into these asylum seeker interview processes, has really strangled us to the point where we have wait times now of 8, 9, 10 hours to cross the border. It's crazy. And when you think about all the human suffering that goes along with those wait times, think about taking you 7 hours to go to the office in the morning from your home. What challenges would you face with that? It's a very, very tough situation. And one of the things that we continue to forget, and people don't realize on the border, many of us have our sister city on the other side, but we're one city in two countries. Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, one city in two countries. And so we have a north side and a south side, and there's constant interaction back and forth every day with people moving back and forth. We have 50-some people in our company who actually are U.S. citizens that live in Mexico and work on our banks every day and cross the border every day. There are people going to school who access maybe a Catholic education on the U.S. side. Every day there's something going on. There's thousands and thousands of people that come to San Antonio for vacations and entertainment and for buying and to own homes here and own condos here. The list goes on and on and on in terms of the importance of our relationship with Mexico.
Jerry, I want to touch on a point that he made a minute ago about Walmart. In the 1970s, everybody knew what an American car was. It was a Ford, a Chevy, or a Dodge, something of that sort. And we knew that Toyotas and Datsuns, as they were called before they changed their name to Nissan, were Japanese vehicles. What is an American car today? And the supply chains have completely changed, and now our daily lives are completely intertwined with Mexico and Canada. And Dennis mentioned Walmart a minute ago. When Walmart first started, they were intending to sell everything that was made in America.
That's right.
And that slowly changed. I think we might have one manufacturer left of baseball gloves in the United States. All the baseball gloves you see in sporting goods stores now come from out of the country. But talk about our interwoven supply chains here in the U.S.
Well, what you see today is that not only the automotive sector, but pretty much every sector has had a multiple raw materials coming from different countries. The automotive sector is probably the most, for the North American region, Mexico has become the automotive hub of the world. The manufacturing of vehicles, not just of raw materials that are coming from Mexico, but they're also maybe coming from Germany, they may be coming from most of them from the United States, and they come multiple processes, multiple times. So the component parts of a vehicle today is hundreds of different products and materials that come from so many different countries. And our end, but the same thing could be said about a tie, your suit, your shoes, their food. The question is going to be, if you take the North American region per se, Canada, natural resources, Mexico with its young population, and then you have the largest consumer of the world in the United States. We buy everything. There, as a region, is what we all should be thinking about, instead of having to say compete against each other. So the materials that that are coming and being applied to those vehicles are coming from multiple countries. This duty that we're talking about right now, it's going to become a very difficult process of determining how you're going to apply that duty. When in that process of the manufacturing of just-in-time delivery from point to point.
Well, the case here, the case in point would be in today's San Antonio Express News, the article was Toyota may face $1 billion, somewhere between $215 million and $1 billion in extra costs. How much of that do they absorb versus how much do they pass on? Another example that was given in USA Today this morning was a $30,000 vehicle that was assembled in Mexico and imported to the United States would be looking at a $7,500 duty. To your point, that's not 5% if it comes in under the 5% tariff because of the cross traffic that occurs.
Well, and the interconnection here too is you say, well, who cares? Let's just whack them with a tariff. I could probably make that argument with the Chinese because we really have no trade agreements with China, and it's open warfare with China, and that's probably a correct process in my view. But with Mexico and Canada, we have a trade agreement, so we're just basically abrogating that trade agreement. But the other thing we have to be concerned about is that 42% of the products that are coming out of Mexico have U.S. content, 42% content. I mean, 42% of what every car and everything that's made in Mexico basically has U.S. content of 42%. So if you wipe out the Mexican side, what do you do with the 42% that is supplied from the United States? What do those people do for their jobs? What part of the industry do we impact because those people now don't have jobs because that product is not being produced? Right. So this interconnection that's gone on for 25 years now has literally woven our two economies together. Yeah, we are now a quilt that's been made with all of these different industries and all these different activities all over the country that have all been woven into this new quilt now that's called this North American economy, and you really can't take it apart. I don't know what you would do today to make or build or deliver virtually anything in our economy today without those resources, and then no telling what the cost would be. I mean, you could easily see the increase of twice the value of a car. We just recently had the Commerce Department slap on tariffs on tomatoes, 17.5% tariff on tomatoes. They're saying accused of dumping Mexican tomatoes. Well, I would dare to say to you, we're going to see a massive crisis in tomato imports. And you're not going to have tomatoes on your sandwiches or in your salad here pretty quickly if we don't solve that problem. So there are so many things going on today that miss the eye of people because they're not involved in international. The way we live on the border, we live in basically two countries, two governments. That's the worst of it right there. We don't only have to deal with U.S. government, you have to deal with Mexican government, and you have to deal with all the municipalities and all the problems associated with it. So it's a very, very tough challenge when somebody pushes this thing off the course for a short period of time. It really can create some problems.
And let's not forget the uncertainty, the cost involved in the uncertainty of what's going to happen next. You brought up the tomato issue. Avocados, even without any tariffs being, now without the 5%, the price of avocados in the last 3 months have gone up 34% because you don't know what's going to happen. So what's next? What product is next? Now we know clearly that the proposal for the new tariffs, but that uncertainty is not good for the economy. It's not good for business.
And if you really want to upset Americans, don't mess with their avocados.
That's right.
Dennis, USMCA had been negotiated. The advocacy effort had started to try to get Congress to ratify it. And then out of the blue, the president threatened to shut down the border. Gerry, you talked about uncertainty. What happens when that kind of threat is made?
Well, you're all are business people and understand the uncertainties of government action. I tell people we live now in a permission society because there's nothing we can do today in the world out there, especially as real estate people. You know that you got to get permission to do everything. You got to go apply to go through some governmental process to do everything. So you can imagine if the main core of your business opportunities were going to be shut off from one day to the next, all of the decisions that are being made to enhance and to expand the business world on both sides of the border are being made many years in advance. I mean, we've had, like U.S. Cold Storage just built a massively new cold storage facility in Laredo. That was a 3 or 4 year project before they started thinking about it until they actually executed and actually built it and finished it. So how many of those projects now get stopped or put on hold because somebody says, wow, what's going to happen? Do we build a multi-million-dollar facility to handle cold storage on the border when there's going to be no border? How do you make a decision? What lapses occur in that process? And that's going on every day. We have a very, very large company, a worldwide company that Jerry met with just a few weeks ago that wants to build a big cool refrigerated facility for what? Bring in avocados. And it's a multi-million-dollar facility. Do they do it or do they not do it? So you've got every single major trucking company in the world that's in Laredo, and you've got rail transportation going on. All these things are going on. So that uncertainty of the governmental process and the ability to do business really puts a blanket on everything. And so you see stuff starting to slow down, projects put on hold, investment delayed, and that's the problem. And then it takes a long time for that to get started up again and for the confidence to reignite the investment cycle. So it's really scary. And then here in San Antonio, so what does it matter here in San Antonio if you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 hour bridge waits on the border? Well, I can tell you, your Semana Santa, your Easter results in San Antonio across to Texas was down anywhere from 20 to 30 to 40% from people deciding not to come. They're not going to go through the hassle of all of the traffic and the problems at the border. So the Mexican visitor, investor, and visitor doesn't come anymore. So they stay home. And so your restaurants, your hotels, your shopping centers, all suffer the pains of not having that customer. So that's how it directly affects San Antonio. And all the traffic, you're on the NAFTA corridor, here on I-35. That is the NAFTA corridor. And so all of the things you're doing out here at Brooks and at Kelly and all the other things you're doing to encourage trade all goes down the tube because somebody made a decision that stops the investment flow and stops investment from coming. And that investment's not just U.S. investment, that's Mexico. We handle a lot of big customers who are very active in buying and supporting the economy of the United States. They invest in businesses, they build buildings, they occupy offices, they buy homes, they build industrial parks. Those things are going on every day. So that interconnection that we talked about is occurring constantly. It's almost just like I described it. It's like breathing. It goes on all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we can't stop that.
Right. Don't forget that 80% of all of the commerce, all of the goods and services that are coming across our border is by truck. And when you have delays, and that delay component, they have to look at alternative sources of mode of travel, whether it's rail or it's air. It may be more expensive, or it may shift to a different mode of transportation because of the just-in-time delivery. Those are reactions that companies need to make very quickly, and decisions that need to be made based on quick decisions. We just, our day begins today, in today's environment, my day begins having to watch a 7 a.m. press conference by President Lopez Obrador to see what he's going to say. Then I got to worry about the tweets or the emails that pop up. We got Frank Bernie doing a tweet watch right now, making sure that what we're saying doesn't change, right, Frank? So that's our day to day.
And for those who aren't familiar, President Lopez Obrador has a press conference every single morning, 7 days a week at 7 a.m. And I get a YouTube alert, and then I don't get a tweet alert, but eventually from the American side, but it does happen. So you were talking about uncertainty, traffic. When the president reassigned 750 Customs and Border Protection agents, we saw huge backups at the border. That delays everything. If you remember during A few years ago, Ross Perot Jr. used to always say in Fort Worth that every time a truck gets stuck at the border, I lose money because I've got people on the loading dock waiting to unload and they don't have anything to unload. So what happened there when all those people were reassigned? You saw, I know in the Rio Grande Valley, the city of McAllen was supplying 20 gallons of fuel per truck to ensure that the trucks did not run out of fuel before they got across the bridge. They had no place to use the restroom. They ran out of food and water. When you're in a cargo line like that, and also the companies had to go replace the drivers. And because the drivers had reached their, what happened?
There are limits in regards to the hours of operation service.
And there's a large volume of what we call intra-city activity going on in Laredo, for instance, between the two ports, the Mexican side and the U.S. side, and there's logistics carriers that go back and forth multiple times, and there's usually a 4 to 5 trip day that's available because of the time it takes to load and cross. Those trips were down to 1 or to nothing.
Right.
And so all of the people who do survive on that business started doubling and tripling their costs because they only got to travel one time, so they wanted to make nearly the same amount of money, so they just raised the rates. So all of these things create enormous obstacles. And then you have people who arrive at the border from the interior of Mexico who are coming to visit San Antonio, and they get caught in a 7 or 8 hour or 9 hour line to cross the border. They're not prepared for that. So they fundamentally, they can run out of fuel, they don't have any water, they don't have any restroom facilities. Everybody was very, very worried about the treatment of the asylum seekers, which is obviously a humanitarian issue. But what about the humanitarian issue on the border with all of these people, literally hundreds of thousands of people waiting to cross the border, and there's no place to go, no place to get away from it, and you just had to sit there and wait. And then when we talked to the CBP people, the Customs and Border Protection people, and asked them, well, what expedited processes have you put in place to deal with this? And they say none. You know, that's the kind of feedback we get from the federal government. It's very disturbing, and especially when they're 3 or 4 years behind the curve already in staffing and all of the infrastructure support it takes to support that border. So why do you, in this room, you say, well, what do we care? Well, number one, it's our largest trading partner. Hundreds of thousands of jobs in Texas are at risk. It's probably the primary reason why the state of Texas has grown so rapidly as one of the key components of that growth, even as equal to or exceeds the oil and gas industry in the state. It's the best kept secret in Texas probably because people that are in the northern part of the state, we say Texas probably stops for us at the Nueces River because people from the northern part of the state don't pay any attention to what's going on the border. And the border, frankly, today is the most dynamic part of the state in terms of raw percentage growth. Obviously, it doesn't have the scale that a Dallas or San Antonio or Austin has, but that growth is enormous. But what's happening today and what's confusing the issue is the immigration problem and the failure to deal with that. And so if you sit in the Mexican side and they say, well, yeah, we should do maybe more to help on the southern border with asylum seekers, but why hasn't Congress changed the laws and dealt with the issues that we have here in the States? Because the asylum seeking problem is directly related to our outdated laws that have not been modified to deal with this thrust. And so who do you blame for this? Why hasn't Congress acted? Why hasn't a bill been presented to correct this and change this? And so you end up with a problem of having to deal with thousands of people who basically are gaming our inefficient and inaccurate and really wrong system that is in place today, and we don't do anything about it. I mean, that just frustrates the living devil out of all of us on the border because that is absolutely dereliction of responsibility at the federal level to deal with that.
I wake up every day and I thank the Lord that I live and work in Texas and that I live 1,200 miles away from Washington, D.C. And what I say is that the crisis that people are saying to us on the border, the crisis is in Washington, when you can't get anything done. People are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that creates the chaos and interrupts our way of life and our business life down here for something good, and you're just messing it up.
So, Gerry, I want to go back to USMCA for a moment because in 1992, well, recently the president said NAFTA was the worst trade agreement in the history of the world, and then he said USMCA was the greatest trade agreement in the history of the world. So what changed? But before you answer that question, I want us to give the audience perspective as to the difference between now and 1992. I want us to give your little Apple, Google, Amazon analogy.
Well, I heard this comment, in some of the negotiating round, we were talking about it. If you really look at it, what's happened in the last 20 years, 25 years, Amazon was a river in Brazil. Google is something we scribble, right? And then Apple was a fruit. That goes to show you how times change in our lifetime, including the 25 years NAFTA, has had to be upgraded, modernized. It really is, it's an existing agreement, understanding that all prior trade agreements that the United States has entered with, primarily with Canada, and have been an improvement, in each one of the incoming agreements. USMCA is an improvement of NAFTA 1.0. We got digital trade issues, we got telecom issues, we got energy issues. You had the e-commerce component of it. All of those were elements that were included, I believe it began in the negotiations of TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that now were incorporated into USMCA. So the process was to make it better. That's what we all sought. And it's not a perfect agreement, but it is a better agreement. That's what we sought to do in the negotiating
Well, at the
process.
same time, too, you had the liberalization of the Mexican oil and gas laws, which were critical.
The reforms, right.
Which created another opportunity for U.S. businesses, once again, to benefit from oil and gas exploration in Mexico, which is a huge opportunity. But I think one of the things also that discolors this whole issue is the immigration problem and the whole idea of where we should be on immigration and border wall, build the wall. And, we have put a lot of time and energy into providing meaningful solutions that are far less expensive and far more effective in the Border Patrol. And the people on the ground recognize that our solution is a better solution. But there's another situation which Gerry talks about that we can't get the Washington people to connect to that. It's a simple process of cleaning up the Rio Grande River. We have a river. It doesn't exist in New Mexico and Arizona and California. It exists in Texas. And it's a viable resource to be used as a deterrent for illegal crossings. And the problem we have today with illegal crossings is not Mexico, it's the Central Americans. There's virtually nobody coming across illegally anymore on the border, except we do have continued problems with drug and other kinds of nefarious activity that exists on the border that needs attention and needs Border Patrol action. But if we don't clean up the river and make it a viable deterrent for a few $1 billion, if there's a carrizo cane and salt cedar that inhabit the river that create a dense cover that people can come across, get into that dense cover and escape in the United States. A wall is not going to help that. It's still going to be a place to hide. And so this whole issue of the asylum seekers is a completely different issue than all the other things that we are trying to face legally on the border. And so the asylum seekers, for you all in the audience, they walk into the country and surrender themselves. There's nobody trying to catch them or run them down or hunt them down like they did formerly with the Mexican illegal immigrant that was coming into this country, where they had to go out literally and capture them out in the wild. These people walk up and say, I surrender. I want the rights of the asylum seeker. I fear for my life. And so, bam, you're into our asylum process that has to be under the law. That's what needs to be changed. But the bottom line of this immigration issue is that we haven't failed we've gone through, this will be the fourth president that has not dealt with the immigration issue. And if you all want to do yourself a favor, everybody needs to read this book. And it talks about the tremendous problem we have with workforce. And I would suggest that everybody in this room that's in the real estate business is already confronting that.
So the name of the book is What to Expect When No One's Expecting, and it's about our declining fertility rate in the United States. My family's, I usually say my family's not average, but today I'll say my family's not normal. But my father was one of 11, mother was one of 11, I'm one of 5, my wife Christina's one of 5, and we have 3. And so you can see, and the kids went from being a profit center because they were working in the family business or the family farm to being a cost center.
Especially yours?
So yeah, especially mine. But it has a huge impact on the economy. Yeah. I want to just, one more quick question, because then we need to take questions from the audience. A month or so ago, you were in Mérida, Mexico, at the U.S. Mexico CEO Dialogue. You had a chance to visit with the Secretary of State, Marcelo Ebrard. You had a chance to visit with President López Obrador, and to hear the conversation from all the American CEOs and the Mexican CEOs there at that event. And that was prior to the tariffs and prior to the shutdown, or excuse me, the slowdowns. What was the mood at that time from the Mexican side?
Well, I would describe the mood of new government as, always optimistic and always forward-looking and visionary, and that's what we heard from all the secretaries and we heard from the president, and that's to be expected. And I think the general attitude in the room was positive. There's a lot of very cautionary feelings from the private sector in Mexico because, like most political ideas, they're visionary to a point, and then when you get down into the devil in the details, it becomes a whole different story. And so everybody's very anxious about that part of it. But there's a tremendously positive relationship between the Mexican private sector and the U.S. private sector and the whole political establishment down there at this point, and it always has been. We are nervous about the liberal agenda of AMLO and that whole group of ministers, but time will tell. We're not helping that process by creating a nationalistic view and creating a populism in Mexico that becomes anti-American. That doesn't help us in any of this thing that we're doing. So we're really kind of slapping the face of our neighbor, and it's going to create repercussions. At this point, it hasn't. And AMLO, I think, President of Mexico, has acted very carefully. And he's been more of a diplomat, obviously, than Trump has been in this process. And I hope that stays together. But on this tariff thing, we don't know. We had no sense that there was any kind of negotiations going on at that time to deal with the Mexican southern border. And we would have hoped, before you go slap tariffs on, that you would have sent a delegation down and try to work out a remedy for the southern border of Mexico on trying to prevent more of these asylum seekers from crossing the border down there, and to put some resources into that border from our side to reduce our costs on this side. So I have no sense that that's even taken place. And so that would be a tragedy to go and slap these tariffs on without having an initial discussions in which we would try to get a better response and a more specific response. But we have to really deal with our legislative side in a big way, and I would hope that more people would understand how important it is for us to be engaged, because the complacency we're seeing out here today, in the business world especially, is just getting very alarming. And in the population as a whole is getting alarming. I would use your most recent election here in San Antonio. I mean, this city should be ashamed of itself. When you go out and elect a mayor and have with 11% of the vote, I mean, there is a systematic problem we have that's really disturbing. And when we have bad results and we get only 11% of the eligible voters go out and vote in a critically important election like the mayor of San Antonio and the importance that has for the future of this city, and we don't vote, we've got to really shake ourselves a little bit and say, what are we going to do in the future, and who are we going to end up in leadership? Because my personal opinion, we have a huge deficiency in leadership, not only across the state, but across the country. Where is Abbott? Where is Patrick screaming about the possible imposition of these tariffs on our border and to wreck our economy and wreck your economy here in San Antonio? Where are they screaming about this assault on Texas? I don't hear it. I see a little bit of noise from Cornyn. I saw some noise this morning from Cruz. But we've got to have our public officials fight this process, because we're at the front line of this. We're on the right on the doorstep of this problem, and if we don't take care of it, nobody's going to take care of it. So it's important that we push all of our elected officials, at our trade associations, all of our organized groups, and then we also participate ourselves and go to these meetings and attend these processes, because we've got a really big problem. And this issue of immigration is critical. Workforce issues are upon us. I have said between now and 2030, this world is going to completely change for us in America. You know, all you have to do is look around the room and see all the gray hairs here, because they ain't going to be around by 2030, me included. You know, and who's going to take over this role to lead this country, and who's going to do that? That's happening with the baby boomers retiring at 10,000 a day, and by 2030 they're all going to be retired, or they're all going to meet their final maker. And what are we going to do with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren that we leave behind, and what's going to happen? This is a serious problem, and it's not 50 years away. It's now.
It's upon us.
And if we don't get more involved, we're going to have serious consequences that are going to be snowballing every year as we move forward time. Our company, IBC, we cannot get below 100 vacancies in our company. I was talking to a group in the resort business the other day. They were having terrible problems. They were 100 to 150 people short. I don't know, maybe this room have got problems with finding workers and finding skilled workers and finding semi-skilled workers or finding basic workers who can cut yards or do small tasks in our businesses. Those people don't exist anymore. And the only place they're coming, the Fed has said in the next 20 years, we will need more than half of the new job growth in immigrants. So if we don't have an immigrant policy that provides and manages all of this, how are we going to do that? Right. And I think we should make certain that that policy is correct.
So the message needs to be very clear. We cannot afford for people to be spectators. You need to be engaged. And I was reminded of that Ronald Reagan quote, that if you cannot see, get them to see the light, get them to feel the heat. And we got to really start cranking up the heat and getting people involved and engaged in this process to get the solutions to what our future is going to look like.
All right, we've got time for one or two quick questions. We do have microphones in the audience if anybody would like to ask one. And while you're stepping up to the mic, I will share with you that there are more Americans moving to Mexico than Mexicans moving into the U.S. Most of the migrants we have that are seeking asylum are coming from the Central American countries of Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Councilwoman Villagran.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this conversation, very insightful. You mentioned about Washington, D.C. and for somebody to do something. Yesterday, the House did pass, we talked about needing workers, et cetera. Yesterday, the House did pass the America Dream, Promise and Dream Act. And now to see it move forward, I know there are always inefficiencies and deficiencies that are there. You mentioned devil in the details, but we do need something moving forward. So what would be your, what do you see coming forward from this moving forward to the Senate, and if anything is going to get done?
Well, we did, there was a bill, H.R. 6, that was passed by Congress, which is a good bill, and our intelligence says that it's going to die in the Senate. You know, and that's the problem we have with so many things, is that there's a lot of really decent legislation that goes through the House and dies in the Senate, and the Senate is supposed to be the deliberative body. Well, they deliberate for days and weeks and years and never do anything done. So, yeah, I think it's a good piece of legislation and it should be passed. It does solve the DACA problem, and it solves the people here that are under temporary
protected status.
Status, and so
the Senate is key. The Senate is key. In NAFTA 1.0, back then, you talk about the 100 senators. We needed. Basically, you needed 60 votes to get anything passed back there before the nuclear option issue came up. You know how many votes we got in the Senate for passing NAFTA? 61. Okay, so it wasn't, the Senate becomes the key player in this. So don't take anything for granted. Every vote counts, reaching out to everybody.
So two last thoughts. Number one, if you have not seen the documentary, The River and the Wall, check it out. It's available for rent or purchase on YouTube or Amazon Prime. It's about 5 people who traveled from El Paso to Brownsville over a 3-month period without using vehicles. They went on horseback, on foot, on canoe, and by horseback. So it took them 5 months to get from El Paso to Brownsville. The first thing that you will feel when you watch this is the pride of the majesty that is the great state of Texas. You kind of forget about different parts of the state, and you get to see what's out there. So it's a great documentary.
And one of the things that we continue to emphasize in terms of what Eddie's saying there is that the river, Rio Grande River, is an amenity for us. We don't want a wall blocking it off from being able to see or visit it or use it. I don't know how many of you all have ever actually gone down and looked at the Rio Grande River, and it's a pretty majestic piece of waterway, and so people in other parts of the country who have rivers see them as valuable assets to their communities. Maybe not in Arkansas these days with the river, but obviously rivers and waterways become important enrichment of the life of their area, and the Rio Grande has a tremendous amount of historical importance. And
there's a portion of the documentary that showcases families fishing off of the Mexican side of the river with their kids, and nobody's on the American side of the river because in that area, that's a piece where there is a border fence. So Americans are prohibited from getting past the fence down to access the water line. And thank all of you for coming today. Dennis, Gerry, thank you all very much for not only sharing your thoughts and wisdom today, but on all the efforts you put both in Austin and Washington.
We have this article that we put, this white paper we put together on border security, and if you're interested in it, it's available through our website. And if not, Eddie can send you copies of it, but it talks about all these solutions that we think are important. And they are simple, straightforward solutions. And my ghostwriter on this paper was head of the Border Patrol. So it's factual. It's what people agreed to. In fact, the former commissioner of Border Patrol told me this is right on top, right on target. So why doesn't the White House and the federal government support a common sense solution? And so it's very disturbing to us when we live and work on the border and understand the problems and work every day with the Border Patrol management that works and does the job every day. So there are solutions that are practical and less expensive.
Thank all of you for coming out. Please help me thank Dennis, Nixon, and Gerry Schwebel.